So, good evening, good evening, good evening, and welcome to another Speak Up for Our Planet talk. I can see we've got a much wider audience this evening, which is very, very exciting as far as I'm concerned. People have been telling their friends about us, and we're reaching an audience way beyond the extremes of my personal contacts book. So I just want to mention very quickly, I think many of you know that this whole thing, the whole Speak Up for Our Planet event, is a collaboration between Rotary and Toastmasters. So that's why I have those two logos up behind my head. And just on this particular occasion, I'd like to tell you just very briefly about Rotary, because many people here are not Rotarians, not aware of Rotary. It's a worldwide organization with clubs all over the world. And the environment has been relatively recently chosen as one of their top priorities, which I'm very happy about. There are things that we do all over the place. We plant trees in Africa, we clean up plastic in Amsterdam, we collaborate with councils in Great Britain. There are just hundreds of projects going on all over the world. So if you would like to be involved in environmental projects, whether they're in your back garden, not literally, around the corner, or on the other side of the world, it might well be that Rotary has one that you'd be interested in. So if you would like to know more, just let me know on the email address that I send all the details about these talks to, and I will get you invited to an event which will explain more about Rotary. By the way, if you associate Rotary with the old men and dinner clubs, you're right, but it's changing. Why don't you be part of the change? You can now be part of an e-club, an environmental club, or an international club. There are just many, many ways of getting involved with Rotary now. So, be part of the challenge. But it's now time to introduce Phil Clarke. I will be cutting off at this, before I started speaking, I'll be cutting off the recording, but this talk is being recorded and it will be published on YouTube. So if you don't want to be appearing or anything, then obviously switch off your video. But I will cut it off after the bit where we were all chatting to each other. So Phil is a sustainability consultant. I find that a very interesting idea already. So we need people to mute, please. Ken R, mute. So this guy actually earns his living by telling people about their carbon footprints. So I can't wait to hear about it. Listen and learn. Over to you, Phil.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's try and get the screen sharing again first after the first attempt. So thank you for the kind introduction. Can I just check you're seeing just a single title slide?
Yep.
Happy days. Good. So yes, thank you. I'm very pleased and honoured to be invited to chat to you this evening. I'm also sometimes surprised that I make a living out of talking about sustainability and helping companies. So back in 1988, I trolled off to university to study environmental studies, to varying comments about why don't you go and do a proper degree and other such things. But my parents were very supportive. So I graduated envisaging I'd be walking the waterways of the UK with a Labrador and a Land Rover and sort of checking pollution incidents and solving things that way. Life took a slightly different turn, as it always does. And then 10 years ago, I found myself, I was working for a large IT consulting company. They were looking for a project manager to run their sustainability team, their environmental sustainability team. And that was the job for me. So I ran that for about 10,000 people, looking after their environmental impacts for about 5 years, and then set up Consciam, my own business, almost exactly 6 years ago. So yeah, so for 6 years, the desire was to make a difference, to help companies to understand what environmental issues were, how they impacted them as a business, and why they needed to take action from a business case as well as being the right thing to do. I have to say the last 12 months has been quite challenging. Along with many other businesses, I saw pretty much all of my clients put environmental focus on hold while they dealt with the impact of the pandemic. But encouragingly, since sort of November time, we've seen a huge uptake in work. Clients who had paused projects just really, really keen to now crack on and do the things that they need to do. So that's really, really encouraging. It's also really encouraging to talk to groups like yourselves. Again, 3, 4, 5 years ago, there weren't many opportunities to talk to community groups. There wasn't so much interest. There was a lot of denial around climate change. And I've steadily seen that change. And I've given variations of this presentation a number of times to different community groups. And it's always fascinating to see people's responses and the questions they get asked. And I see more and more the sophistication of people's understanding around sustainability has just come on in leaps and bounds, which is so important if we're going to solve some of the challenges we face. So let's, without further ado, so my brief was to talk for about 20 minutes or so, to then give time for questions. I think I've already wrapped it on for 2 minutes on the introduction, so we'll try and stick broadly to that, but there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. So I gather I'm talking to a fairly well-informed audience, but I still always like to start with some of the basics. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the science and about some of the numbers and some of the facts. And then we'll get into some of the consequences of that and what that means for the planet and ourselves and the other creatures that we share it with. And then we'll talk a bit about personal carbon footprinting, how we can go about measuring our own impacts, and then crucially, what we can do to reduce those impacts. So we live in unprecedented times, as I've started to say. You know, we've seen climate protests become mainstream across the world and within the UK. They've become more disruptive, and those protesting has changed, which I think is really interesting. It's gone from the archetypal, people you would expect to be protesting about the climate, swampy and the like, who it's very easy to dismiss if you wish to suddenly seeing a much broader church of people turning out to protest and complain. So I've been involved in, my fair share of climate marches, from being involved with Extinction Rebellion events in London to climate marches more locally. If anybody's not on mute, could you pop yourselves on mute, please? Thank you. If you've got a question to raise, obviously come off and shout. We're seeing leadership, amazing leadership from different people. So Greta Thunberg, who we all know well, has really, I think, articulated messages very simply, which is the beauty of what she's achieved and what many of us in the industry need to learn from. Just the simplicity of our house is on fire, behave as though it was on fire. The State of Nature is a biannual report that's produced, and that demonstrates massive reductions in wildlife by every single metric you can look at. Some species are growing because they're migrating into warmer areas like the UK as the climate changes, but many of our native species are being lost from the areas of the country that we're used to seeing them in. And for perhaps the first time in 2019, we saw a lot of coverage of climate issues and environmental issues in the general election. So it's becoming part of our psyche, but still not enough action, which is why we need to have more events like me talking tonight and being challenged to answer questions. So I wanted to very quickly talk about the greenhouse effect. Lots of people know about it already, so forgive me if you know this, but I think it's always really useful to just start at the very beginning just to make sure we're all on the same page. So the greenhouse effect is a totally normal phenomena in the environment. If it wasn't for the greenhouse effect, we wouldn't be sat here now. We'd be on a very hot or very cold planet. And in the most simple terms, the greenhouse effect, we have solar radiation comes in from the sun. Some of that bounces off our atmosphere. Some gets absorbed into the sea and the land, and some gets retained within the atmosphere. And that keeps us at the normally lovely sort of temperate conditions that we see on the planet that allows life to thrive. That absorption in the atmosphere is driven by what we call greenhouse gases, so carbon dioxide and methane and water vapor and a number of others. And like everything in nature, they sit in equilibrium quite happily, and they keep us where we want to be. The problem is those gases are being released through our activity, through burning fossil fuels, amongst other things. And the more of those greenhouse gases you put into the atmosphere, the more the atmosphere can retain heat. So I like to think of it as whatever tog duvet you like to sleep under at night. If you sleep with a duvet cover, tog 10.5, you're nice and comfortable. If somebody throws a 4.5 tog duvet on top of you, now you're at 14, 15, you're going to start to get hotter. If someone puts another 4.5 on top, you might get really hot. And ultimately, that's going to start to cause problems for you. So that's kind of a simple way of thinking about the greenhouse effect. But like I say, it's a natural process. We see natural warming of the planet. That's always happened. What we've not seen is the planet warming at the rate that we're currently seeing it. So some quick charts, some scary data, I called it. So the top chart is sort of colloquially known as the hockey stick. So this is data from ice cores over the last 800,000 years, where they've looked at the concentration of carbon dioxide that's trapped in ice, and they can date that back 800,000 years. And what we see is changes in global concentrations of CO2 over that time period, but broadly following similar patterns and broadly happening within the same sort of limits, up to about 280 to 300 parts per million, until the last 200 to 300 years, where it's just gone off the scale. Hence our hockey stick, our J curve, as that level has gone flying up. So the chart on the right is the last sort of 50 to 60 years, and that's not ice core data. That's data that's being observed now in Hawaii, in Mauna Loa. And the little table in green is showing some actual values. So when I took this data off this morning, the latest record they were showing was from the 21st of February at 416 parts per million. It's actually 417 parts per million for Monday when I looked at some of the data. But a year ago, it was at 414. And 10 years ago, at the same time, it was 392. So we're seeing this massive increase in CO2 levels, which we can link to the emissions we're causing on the planet. And if graphs aren't your thing, this is a bit of an experiment. I've never tried doing this in a live presentation before. Let's see if this works. Where's my play button gone? This should be, oh, that's annoying. This worked beautifully when I tried it earlier. So this is a, that's the only thing I can do to get this working. Okay, so this is not going to work, but I can send a link around afterwards. So this is an animation of what the last sort of 130, 140 years or so looks like in sort of color terms. And if it was working, this animation would show years going by and the colors changing from blues and greens, representing about 1880 in comparison to that, in comparison to average, and the end product would have been that color. So it's a lovely animation. It's a really sort of, it's just a simple way of articulating how the planet is warming. And that's based on multiple data points all over the world. And what does that mean? Well, I'm sure you've all heard of the Paris Agreement. So this was a landmark global agreement signed in 2015. And what was just so unique, rather than we're going to do a bit of this and we're going to do a bit of that, there was consensus that we had to limit the rising global temperatures to well below 2 degrees centigrade by 2050. We're currently at about a 1-ish, 1.02 degree in global temperatures, and it varies each year. So it might go down next year, but it'll go up the following year. Pretty much every country in the world signed up to that commitment. There was a lot of, within my circles, there was concern that actually 2 degrees by 2050 was too lenient. We needed to take stronger action and make those reductions more quickly, but we have to start somewhere. We've seen unfortunate things like the US choosing to pull out of the climate accord because they felt it was anti-competitive to American businesses. And that's why it's so important. This is a global accord. It does cause challenges. We do have to do things differently. So we need everybody working together. So one region is not penalized in the way others might be. But obviously good news that America has now rejoined the Paris Agreement. The data in red is more scary data, I'm afraid. So based on the current pledges of governments, we're looking at least 3 degrees of warming, 2.9 to 3 degrees of global warming. If we follow the actual policies that countries have in force, that's more like 3.3 degrees. And if countries don't take any further action, we're going to be at 4.5 degrees of warming. So just remember that range of figures. So 1 is about where we are now. 2 is what the Paris Agreement is committing countries to. 3.5 is kind of where we are on current global policies, and 4.5 is where we're headed. So this is not scientific. It's a bit of fun. It's not my work. I can't claim credit for that. But kind of reading round from bottom right-hand corner, the blue. So this is attempting to articulate what sort of impacts we're going to see from a rise in global temperatures. So where we are today, sort of 0.8 to 1 degree, we see more heat waves, we see ocean warming, we see melting of the polar ice caps, we see sea levels rising as a consequence. We see the impact on species extinctions and moving their territories, and extreme weather events. And it's probably extreme weather events that we tend to actually see and feel more of in the UK. One of the unfair and unfortunate consequences of the way we've behaved as a society is most of the negative impacts have been caused by people who live in areas of the world that are probably going to be least impacted directly by climate change. But you've only got to listen to the weather and constantly hear we've just had the wettest winter ever recorded, or the hottest day ever recorded, or the coldest day ever recorded, or the windiest weather, or the whatever. There's always some sort of extremeness about it, and we're just going to see more and more of that because the temperature of the seas is changing, and that drives different weather patterns. So prepare for more extreme weather as we go forward. And that has all sorts of consequences. So I'm working with some house builders at the moment and trying to encourage them to think about building houses that will be fit for a changing environment, that will cope with hotter weather, colder weather, all of these things. So really trying to think about how people will use those houses over the next 30 to 50 years. And as we move around clockwise on this, so as we get into sort of 1 degree, we're starting to see more and more destruction of coral reefs, more and more threats to low-lying island nations. As we push up to 2 degrees, then things start to get really scary. Losing animals is significant enough, but as we start to see loss of significant amounts of ice, for example, the Greenland and other parts of the polar ice cap, it's going to have massive impacts, again, fueling these extreme weather events and other aspects around the world. But we're also going to see areas become too dry. So there's some real concerns, depending on who you talk to, that certainly areas of North Africa, southern Spain, southern Europe are potentially going to become too dry and too hot for people to comfortably live in. And then we're going to start to see migration of people on a scale that we've never seen. And there are a lot of concerns about the wars of the future. Future won't be over oil. There'll be about access to water and access to food. So some quite terrifying prospects if we don't take action. And bear in mind, this is 3 degrees, and that's where currently global policies are going to take us. And then as we push up into top left, top right, we start to see 4, 5, even 6 degrees of warming. And that, quite frankly, is when life on Earth, for us as we know it, will become extremely challenging. And whether that's directly or whether it's because our food systems have been so fundamentally disrupted by climate change that it just becomes very hard to sustain life as we know it. So that's the gloom, I'm afraid. And it's a challenging job at times because you can't sugarcoat this. You have to talk to companies about the seriousness of some of the crises they face. And if you go back to this slide and you look at this through a business lens, there are some fundamental challenges to businesses. I talk occasionally to businesses that I can pretty much put money on will not be trading in 10 to 15 years' time because their industries just won't exist, either because there will be no longer demand for that, or it just won't be possible to make the products they're making at a price that people will buy them. So perhaps anything made out of virgin plastic, oils, they will get so heavily taxed as we move into some real almost panic potentially from governments to try and control some of this, that if those companies don't look ahead, they'll cease to exist. So that's often a lens I'll use with businesses. If you won't do this for the right moral reasons, think about the fact your business won't be there, or it won't provide you with the retirement fund you're hoping to when you sell your business. So Footprinting. So one of the things we can all do is to understand what our personal impacts are. So this is my carbon footprint, broadly calculated using a WWF, Wild Wild Fund for Nature calculator. It's a really interesting one to have a look at. It's quite simple. You go through and just talk about a few things that you do and how you live and how you travel and what you eat and those sorts of things, and it will come up with a number. So for mine, when I ran these stats, and this is about a year ago, I think I ran these. So my footprint at that point was about 12.5 tons for the previous 12 months. The target was to be at about 10.5 tons at that point. And for context, we're probably aiming for 1.5 to 2 tons per head carbon footprint in the next 10 years or so. So I've got a long way to go. Slightly worrying is that looking on the right hand side there, my footprint is actually below average for the UK. UK average is in the region of sort of 14, 15 tons, depending on what measures you look at it. But the world average is much, much lower. And if you go into parts of Africa, you'll probably find someone's carbon footprint is more in the order of 0.5 ton to a ton. So how does that break down? Well, this is a slight cheat slide, I'll be honest up front. So don't try and compare the numbers on the left and right because they don't add up properly, but I wanted to illustrate a different point and I needed a bit more detail to do that. So the WWF calculator will tell you broadly how your carbon footprint is made up. So the proportion on travel, the proportion around what you eat. Home is broadly the amount of energy you use in terms of gas and electricity. And stuff is simply stuff, things you buy. So what this tells us is my broad 12-ton carbon footprint. Stuff is the biggest thing that I contribute to. And when we talk about how do we change our impacts, it's really important to understand a concept called materiality. So the first bit of that is knowing how big your footprint is. And the second bit is knowing how it's comprised, because once you know that, you can make sure you take really impactful actions. So for my footprint, it's not far off even splits, but I could look at the data on the right, which I've calculated a bit more accurately, and I can see straight away that last year, for the first time in many years, in fact, the first time ever, the whole family, we went to the USA. We gave the kids the holiday of a lifetime that they've always wanted. They're 20 and 18, so we won't be having many more trips with them. We flew to New York, we then flew on to LA, and we flew home from San Francisco. My personal flights for those 3 legs was 2.7 tons of carbon. So about 25% of my total annual footprint was that luxury of just flying across the pond and back. So if you travel a lot, that's a really important area to think about. Do I need to do that? Do I need to do it as often? But you can also see in there some of the things that are harder. So 1.5 tons is gas and electricity. Well, yeah, I'm a relatively low gas and electric user for a 4-person family. Because of what I do for a living, I read my meters every week and I'm the one constantly turning the thermostat down, but I still generate 1.5 tons per year of carbon related to that. I drive an efficient vehicle. Admittedly, some of this is business mileage, but 10,000 miles in my very efficient diesel car that I drive with a light right foot to maximize my fuel use is still 2.5 tons. But my trade-off could be, do I want to drive my car or do I want to fly to the States on holiday? And then food and drink. So we'll come on to this in a bit more detail, but if you don't eat meat, that figure comes down quite significantly. So what can we do about it? So I've already talked a little bit about some of these things. I think one of the things to really understand is it's very much a personal journey. You know, everybody has their own areas that they feel they can make a difference, or they feel currently they're prepared to make a change in lifestyle. But sometimes we have to recognize affordability. There is a fundamental problem with so-called green things. Green things are often seen to be very expensive, and they are in compared to standard options. But the reality is that those cheaper options, your 2 chickens for £5, they're cheap because no one's paying for what we call the externalities, the external costs to the planet of providing me a chicken for £2. They're not paying for the ethical impact of a chicken's living conditions that's bred to that price point. So I'm very fortunate. Well, I don't eat meat anymore, but when I did eat meat, very fortunate I could afford to make the choice to eat better quality meat, but eat it less frequently. So we only ate meat, say 2 or 3 days a week at that point. My family still eat meat. I'm the one that doesn't, but probably only once a fortnight. So our footprint is still lower. So you don't have to go fully vegetarian to make a difference. And we'll go into all of these in a bit more detail. So I've already mentioned eating less meat is really important. Dairy is also a huge producer of environmental impact through water use and agricultural emissions. And one of the big myths around meat and dairy is people talk a lot about the carbon emissions that come from a burping cow. That's true. There are, well, it's methane emissions that come from that predominantly, but the biggest impact when you look at it in the full life cycle of producing a kilogram of beef is everything that goes into it. It's an incredibly inefficient way to produce protein. So you use huge amounts of water, huge amounts of soya. So one of the claims often thrown at vegetarians is they eat too much soya. Well, actually, a fraction of I think it's under 1% of the soya that is grown on the planet is actually eaten by humans. Most of it goes into feed for dairy, for chickens, for you name it. So being aware of that you can make a difference by eating less or eating no meat is really important. And often, my footprint I showed you earlier was, I think, about 1.2 tons for food. By stopping eating meat and dairy, you take about half a ton or so out of that, depending on how much you eat. So a pretty significant saving. So eating local food, eating seasonal food, we're so used to, and again, I'm guilty of this. I love a blueberry. It's part of a healthy lifestyle. It's a superfood, but of course, blueberries don't grow in this country at this time of year. So you can pretty much guarantee that if you do go to your fridge and look at that punnet of blueberries, it's either come from Peru or perhaps Egypt, but that would have been air freighted in almost certainly. So a huge carbon footprint related to that, and a few other bits and pieces on there. I think it's that thinking before we eat. Where has my food come from? What are the potential environmental impacts of that food? And there are a lot of examples out there and much more information that you can find. So travel, we've touched on that. So I've demonstrated the huge impact that flying has, and that's flying economy class. So, if you're fortunate enough to be able to fly premium economy, you can probably multiply your flight carbon by about 1.2-ish. If you're flying business class, it's around 1.5 to 2 times the carbon. And if you're flying first class, then it's 2 to 3 times. And that's simply because you've just got less people occupying the space. So you've got more fuel being burnt to move the same number of people around. So interestingly, lots of things here that if we'd have gone back sort of probably 30, 40, 50 years, people would have done more of. So lots more walking, lots more cycling, lots more public transport, which has got harder these days. But there's lots of challenges and things we need to ask ourselves. Do I really need a car? And we're going to see more and more autonomous vehicles coming on. So self-driving vehicles will make more and more of a mark in the coming years. And there's some quite interesting and exciting studies around how that will actually become an income generator. So if you're lucky enough or you choose to be able to buy an autonomous vehicle, at some point in the future, you'll be able to set up controls that say, I need my car between 9 and 10 this morning, but the rest of the day, I don't need that £30,000 car sat on my driveway. So it being autonomous, somebody else can go on an app and say, I need to borrow a car to get from A to B. Your car pops off your drive, you earn some money, somebody else gets a journey, but we haven't had to buy 2 cars to achieve that. So I talked a bit about driving smarter. In a previous life, we did some work with the Carbon Trust, and when I worked at Capgemini, and we took 20 or 30 people, we got them to drive around a 2 or 3 mile circuit around one of the local towns. Then an advanced driving instructor told them about their driving and encouraged them to think about anticipating more and slowing down, gently slowing down, and then being able to gently accelerate rather than having to suddenly brake and start from scratch. And pretty much every person used at least 10% less fuel on the second lap when they drove more gently, and some people used 20 and 30% less fuel. So you can make a real difference, and less fuel means less carbon burnt, less environmental impact. And obviously it saves you a bunch of money as well. Replacing vehicles, so electric vehicles are obviously very popular. Electric vehicles are great from the point of view of having no tailpipe emissions, so no air pollution in terms of nitrogen dioxides, which is obviously bad for our breathing. But don't just go and buy an electric vehicle. It really comes down to, do I need a vehicle in the first place? Because building electric vehicles still uses an awful lot of energy and natural resources. Charging that electric vehicle still requires electricity to be produced somewhere, and a lot of our electricity is still produced by gas in the UK. So fossil fuels are being burned. So although they're good, it's not a simple swap out your car and just buy another one. Around your house, again, lots of things you could do. So I showed you earlier, around 20% of my footprint was energy. So I've been using a renewable energy tariff for about 10 or 15 years now through a company called Ecotricity, who are one of the best out there. There are companies that, well, pretty much every company now will sell you a green tariff, a renewable tariff, but like anything in life, they're never quite what they seem. So there's only 2, 3, 4, 5 companies who will turn your bills into mills effectively. They'll actually generate, they'll invest in building solar farms or windmills to generate power. The rest of them use a market mechanism called buying a REGO, which means if you use 1,000 kilowatt hours of electricity a year, they'll supply some electricity and they'll just go onto the market and they'll buy 1,000 kilowatt hours of certificates of energy that somebody else has produced. So they're not really adding anything new. So it's better than nothing, but it's not what you might think you're getting. It's also worth remembering, whatever comes through your plugs is whatever comes from your local power station. So even though I've got a 100% renewable electricity tariff, what I get will be what Didcot is throwing out on an average daily rate, but I'm still making a difference. So lots of other things you can do there to cut your carbon footprint. So turning lights off, turning TVs off, all of the sort of good practice things we would do that save money, as well as improve the life of the appliance because it's not being left sort of hot on standby. If you are doing work to your house, that's a really good opportunity to do some of the bigger, more expensive things, like putting more insulation into your house. One of the best things you can do is to just insulate the house so you lose less energy through the walls. You need to put less in to keep the house warm. And then using different temperatures on washing machines, or washing less. So I buy jeans from a company that the first thing they do is encourage you not to wash your jeans for 6 months, because they've done some of the hard thinking, looked at just how much water and energy you use washing your jeans every month. So they encourage you to hang them up on the line, or if you've got a big enough freezer, you put your jeans in the freezer once a week and it kills off the bacteria and your jeans don't smell. So there's some really interesting different things you can do. Finance is also really underestimated. So there'll be a lot of people who have decent pension pots of money or other sources of investments. And we very often don't think about where that money is invested. And if you do have a look, you'll probably find a lot of it is in a standard managed high-ish or medium risk fund. And it almost certainly will be invested in fossil fuels companies because they've delivered great financial returns for many, many years. But the more we can vote with our banking and our pensions and our investments in our savings, there's many, many different funds out there now. There are banks that behave differently. You can make a real difference. And the message is starting to get across to businesses that actually people don't want to invest in you if you haven't got a sustainable story to tell. And some of that is because it feels good. It feels good to invest ethically, but it's also simple economic sense. Go back to what I was saying a few moments ago about there are businesses that will cease to exist unless they change their business model. Well, you don't want to have all of your pension fund invested in a business that won't be operating when you want to be taking that money out. So that's something to think about, how you can invest differently. And then last one, we talked about stuff, buying less stuff. So again, there are financials issues here. We live in a society where a lot of people choose fast fashion because they want to refresh their wardrobe constantly, and that's the most cost-effective way to do it. It's very easy to criticize those people, but it's really important to also recognize that some people just can't afford to buy expensive, more durable clothes. So that's when we need to work with the manufacturers to encourage them to think about their manufacturing processes and not just build their model on a £1 t-shirt, that means somewhere somebody in that supply chain has suffered environmentally or socially. So buying better stuff where you can, getting back to repair and reuse wherever you can. France, I believe, has just passed a law in the last week or so requiring products sold in France, I think it's electrical products, to be repairable. And that's really going to mess with the industry, because a lot of products are designed not to be easily repairable, either deliberately or just because it's the cheapest way to do it. So, bits of your iPhone, for example, if you use one of those, a lot of that is glued together. It's quite hard to take apart and repair. So that's really interesting to see how that's going to drive the market. And then really just the last point is kind of thinking about those impacts. So very much starting with, do I need it? Because I could, hand on heart, I could look at that huge chunk of my carbon footprint of stuff I buy. No, I didn't need it. I wanted it. And that's, me trying to be honest about some of the choices I make, and I have to fight that, and I know some of the consequences. So I know it's hard, but really asking yourself, do I need it? What's it been made of? Where has it been made? Does it feel too cheap to be true? Can it be repaired? These are really good questions to ask. So I was going to stop there. I've talked for much longer than I should have, but I think I did warn Jane that once I start talking about this, I can't stop. So I hope that's been useful and interesting. I'll stop screen sharing now, and then we can pick up some questions.
Well, thank you, Phil. What a lot to think about. I'm actually quite chuffed, because the last talk we had was about green investing, and the next one is about fast fashion. So you've introduced them both beautifully for us. Thank you. So no, a lot of stuff that made me think. Obviously, there's a lot of things there that we already knew about, but we're probably quietly ignoring. So you've pricked consciences here, I'm sure. But also, it's interesting to know what the proportionate values of these things are. How a flight to the States is worth almost as much as driving a car for a year. That's quite a thought. So please, anybody who would like to ask a question, put their hand up or put a note in the chat, and I will try to monitor both. So I'm just going to put myself onto gallery view again so I can see everybody. Keith, are you waving your hand in the air?
Yes, I've also put my electronic raised hand as well.
Okay, ask a question.
Well, I've got a question and also a comment. One comment to reinforce quite a bit what Phil was saying. You have to be very careful about things like electric vehicles. And some people sort of think, well, because the carbon emission factor for electricity in the UK has dropped by over 60% in the last 5 years, that's becoming an attractive proposition. But that may be the case in the UK, but in some countries, such as Poland, Victoria in Australia, if you actually drive an electric car, because the emission factor is so high in their fossil fuel generation of electricity, it's actually worse than a diesel car. So you've got to look at it in very much in the sort of local context. The other thing is that I'd like to thank Phil for a very good sort of summary of this and doing the of thinking about the personal carbon footprint. But in fact, within Rotary, we are actually now tackling the separate issue of what is the impact of a Rotary Club's activities on things, which is separate from the actual personal one. And I'm in a team of 4 who are leading this. That's Melbourne, Australia, Wellington, New Zealand, Los Altos, California, and Norwich in the UK. And we are just coming to the end of the first stage of that. And we are looking for about 3 or 4 other clubs within our respective areas who might help us to actually extend this to before we went to Rotary throughout the world. So if any clubs, in particular is Gerald Cross, is interested, we would be, please contact me.
Okay, thank you, Keith. I knew Keith had been doing an awful lot of work on this, so I was kind of hoping he was going to show up this evening. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think, Keith, that's a great point, and it's one of the really misunderstood issues. And so, we talk a lot about running electric vehicles in India is really not a good choice at the moment in many ways, because it's almost entirely coal-fired energy generation in India. So it's actually much better for the environment to burn petrol than use an electric vehicle in India. But it's also used slightly, choose my words carefully. The fossil fuel lobby will sometimes talk about the negative impacts of a electric vehicle, and quite often they'll cite the tail or the emissions related to an electric vehicle being much higher than they are, because they're using places like Poland or Germany, which still has a very high amount of coal in its energy mix. So they'll use that, but they won't say that. So it just kind of gives an unclear example. So it's really important when you do hear criticism of environmental things to certainly listen to it, because not everything touted as being environmentally good is right. But always sort of dig into the data and just check it's a fair comparison. Okay,
so Chris Davis has his hand up.
Yeah, and hi. So I work in the environment officer for District 1070, and we've set the target for all members to calculate their carbon footprint and also work out the average for the club, and then they've got a 10% reduction target for the year. We're using 3 or 4 different calculators, and they're all pretty vague, so we get a lot of criticism about their kind of weaknesses because they're indicative. Yes. And they give you a different result, so you get 2 or 3 tons different about it. And then I get a lot of members saying to me, well, you know, I've got 50 trees in the back garden, and I know a ton will sequester roughly a tree will sequester roughly a ton over its lifetime. And I've been looking into the research of that, and most of it's on tropical trees. So if somebody says I've got an oak, you know, it's 4 years old, I can't give them an accurate figure. So we just use an average of 17.5 kilograms per year. To make them feel bad when we calculate that they've got 40 trees, but it actually hardly impacts on what they're doing. So is there a better tool than, because we use the bulb one and the WWF one and various others, but is there a better tool that I can go back and say, well, actually, it's not quite as noddy as it seems?
So it depends how far you want to go, right? So every year, so all these carbon calculators should be using a bunch of government provided emission factors every year, and I work with some of that raw data. So I've got a spreadsheet here, and I can send you a link to it. It's publicly available, that has emission factors for everything you could pretty much want to measure, and they should all be using that data. But I know when I do, and I saw there was a question from Rosie Miller as well, similarly the validity of some of the calculators, I see somewhere I can't get them to add up. So I use a lot of spreadsheets, and I use government data, and I use raw energy data or flight data, whatever it might be, and I will sometimes find that they don't add up with what some of these calculators are showing. I can normally reverse engineer it and find out actually the factors they've got in are 2 or 3 years out of date, or they're just using, you know, the WWF one is very much intended to be indicative. It's not supposed to be a really detailed footprint, which is why on the slide I had my footprint as a wagon wheel and a list, because I'd gone and calculated that from sort of first principles. But there's really good ones. There's a company called Climate Care, who are one of the best offsetting companies that I know of in the country. We could talk about offsetting as well. But they have theirs is pretty good. You'll probably find at this time of year, they might still be using last year's emission factors compared to the 2021 ones aren't yet out. So you might see some variation there, but I think you'll probably find they'll give you a more accurate figure.
Thank you.
And they then give you the option
to put Climate Care into the chat. Is that enough information for people to be able to find it?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So we have quite a few questions in the chat. Rosie, I think you've covered, do all carbon calculator packages deliver the same results from the same input data? You've already said not really. Have you tested this? I'd like to be sure I'm recommending a reliable one. So
I think it's probably fair to say most of the ones I look at will give you broadly the right answer, and they will almost certainly give you an answer that's within the limits of the accuracy of the data you're putting in. So you know, I can debate it, you know, is it 10 tons or 11 tons or is it 9 tons, but it's still somewhere between 9 and 11 tons, which is not good, or is not good compared to where you want to get to. But it will also be indicative that, you know, I had a friend who lived a few miles away from me, so I live over in Woburn Green, so not far from many of you. He lived locally, but his desk was actually in Denver, Colorado. So on a Monday morning, or a Sunday night, he'd jump on a plane and he'd fly to Denver, and he'd come home on a Thursday night, and he'd do that about 3 weeks a month, and then have a week at home. you can imagine his footprint looked very, very different to mine. So at that point, whether it was 9 or 11 tons becomes irrelevant, because his you could stick a naught on. So it's useful to get those indicative numbers, and then you can take action around that.
Thank you. Right, a question from Gwyneth. How does the carbon footprint of producing almond, oat and other non-dairy milk compare with the real milk?
So I haven't got those stats to hand, but it is different. There is a really good, I'm trying to remember what it said. There's a really lovely chart that kind of explains that, because it's quite different for all of them. So dairy milk is the highest. As I mentioned earlier, there's just so much, that there are so many ancillary products that go into making a pint of milk, so much food stuff that's been grown and shipped around the world, and water and all the rest of it. I believe oat milk has the lowest footprint of all of those, but what I could do is try and find that link and share it with you.
That'd be great. If you want to, rather than doing it now, if you want to email it to me,
yeah,
I'll share it around the this group. Yeah, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
And it's a really interesting, I talked about companies needing to change. So I think it's Arla Foods, who are one of the biggest dairy companies in the UK. They've bought non-dairy milk brands, and we're seeing more of these. I think they call them lifeboat investments, where a big corporate is realizing there's a bit of a challenge ahead, so they go and buy a competitor almost that would be making dairy milk, non-dairy milk rather than dairy milk, because they know that's the way forward, and that's how they can accelerate into that marketplace.
Great. Okay, so do you have an opinion on the UK government's rejection of energy from tidal generation in the Bristol Channel, specifically the Swansea Tidal Barrage? That's Steve in Cardiff. That's
a really interesting one. So so when you first started talking about do I have an opinion on the UK government, I was going to mute myself, because sometimes I do confess I go off on a rant. So tackling that one first, right? So we were the first country in the world to declare a climate emergency, and to set, or Parliament did, and to set this really strong net zero by 2050 goal. No one else had done that. The problem, as ever, with any government, putting politics aside, is that sounds great. It took a lot of pressure off them, but the action is just nowhere near. So, at the same time as we're reaffirming our commitments to goals like that, we're still not putting out a framework of how we're going to do it. We're still spending 110 billion or whatever it is on HS2, which is tearing up. Well, it's going to use huge amounts of carbon to build it. The general consensus is it will have a negative carbon impact over its lifetime, not a positive carbon impact, because it's so hard to build a railway line. It's tearing up environmental sensitive areas all over the country. So yeah, frustration there around the government not walking the walk. The whole tidal energy is really interesting. So I grew up in Somerset. So I grew up just outside Weston-super-Mare, which could change very differently from the well, certainly when I was growing up and they were talking about the barrage, it would go from me never seeing the sea to me probably always seeing the sea, because the tide wouldn't go out in quite the same way as Weston. The Cardiff scheme I'm less familiar with. I think that's a much smaller barrage. These things become really difficult. I mean, the Severn barrage at one point, they were talking about that providing, I think, 5% of the UK's energy needs as renewable energy, which is just so significant. Some of the consequences, though, of that barrage would be horrific in terms of what it would do to internationally important wetland sites up the Severn Estuary. Slimbridge Reserve would be massively affected. So there are some huge implications. Now, I think, say, not knowing enough about those schemes, we've moved more to the concepts of much smaller scale hydro rather than large scale hydro schemes. So rather than covering the whole of the Severn Estuary, you'll do a small thing at Cardiff or a small thing at Swansea and benefit from the massive tidal rise and fall that you have on the Severn Estuary. Hydro is challenging. It can have massive impacts in its traditional form, but increasingly, as I understand it, the technology is changing so that, potentially rather than a physical barrage, you'll have turbines on the floor of an estuary, and they'll just be driven by water passing. So in the same way that a wind turbine is passing because of the air, the same will happen under the water. You just won't see it. or you won't see so much structure. So I'm sorry, I feel that's a bit of a fudge for the question, but I'd be interested to hear any other thoughts around that.
I'm just looking to see if anybody's got an electronic hand up. I don't think I can see any. There's an Eddie who is not quite asking a question. He's more stream of consciousness here a bit, really. But one thing he says is the UK government publishes and updates the reference data that presumably that are used in some of the calculators. Is that?
Yes, yeah. So they get published annually. They're produced by DEFRA and BAYES as two different departments. The data is again, I'll send a link because it's worth, if anyone's interested, it's worth seeing because there's a methodology that goes with it. But actually, if you click through, a lot of the data is derived independently by universities and different organisations. So I like to delve into it because I like to see, you know, some of the real information behind it and how they've calculated those factors. I suspect the question was, are they reliable? I think the answer is probably they're probably the best we've got.
Chris, who we heard from a little bit earlier, who is in a Rotary Club, he says we ask members to donate £10 per tonne to our charity account when the gilt builds. It raises money to plant trees. I like the gilt builds. Yeah, that's very good.
It works very well. We've got several £100 from it so far.
Excellent.
Particularly if they go on long distance flights, we just gentle shame them, we call it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah, and it's, you know, offsetting. I mean, we if anybody wants me to talk about that, I'm quite happy to. Offsetting is challenging because offsetting can often be seen as permission to pollute. So you go on your flight, you tick the little £1.50 donation by your BA checkout page, and you feel better about having flown. That carbon has still been emitted, right? We can't afford for any more carbon really to be emitted to the atmosphere if we're being really serious about this. We're obviously going to accept some to live our lifestyles, but just writing a check to pay for it, I'm not saying it's a bad thing to do, but the most important thing is for us to think about what we're doing and then change some of those behaviors. I offset, I pay every year to offset my emissions because I think we do need to do that, and we need to do everything we can to drag as much carbon out of the atmosphere as we can. And any tree planted is probably going to take 7 years before it really starts to take up carbon. So
I agree with you. We use the term offsetting as off-putting, but then if people have to go, then pay up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we have a question here from Penny. There was a line on one of your charts that indicated that plastic is not the curse we all believe it to be. Could you expand on that?
Oh yeah, I'm trying to remember what chart that was, but no, it's not. I mean, plastic gets absolutely vilified, and quite rightly in some ways, but the important thing is it's single-use plastic. So plastic itself is not a problem. Plastic is a phenomenal resource for us, for a planet, and we're going to need it. What we've got to stop doing is using it for the wrong purposes and using it once and chucking it in a bin if there's an alternative. And it's frustrating. But you look at what, you know, 1 5-minute segment of one episode of The Blue Planet did to prick people's consciousness around environmental issues. And, you know, yes, that's caused a lot of people to focus their effort on reducing their plastic. I heard anecdotally of a lady locally who got very, very excited that Waitrose were trialing a zero waste store up in Oxford. And she so wanted to reduce her plastic use, she jumped in her 4-litre Range Rover, she drove to Oxford, she bought all her zero waste food, and she drove home again in her Range Rover. And it's that kind of, you don't want to berate people for that, but you just want people to try and just think a bit more laterally and understand that the real culprit is sat on your driveway. It's not what's sat in your cupboard.
That's a terrible story.
Sad but true.
There's quite a lot of information in the chat, which isn't really questions, it's more information. So I just want to make sure that everybody knows that you can save the chat if you want to. If somebody would like to try that, I know I can, but maybe that's because I'm the chair of the meeting. Does anybody know? Can you?
Yeah, I can do it.
Excellent. Okay, so if you want to save any of the information in the chat, just save the chat, and you can copy it out and print it or do what you want with it. So Rosie says, new homes are still being built with building standards that are not making them fit for a net zero 2050. Is there any organisation that is challenging them on this?
Me. So yeah, I work with a couple of house builders, and you know, I have a difficult balance to make on some of my projects, and I have some red lines of companies that I won't work with or sectors I won't work with. But generally, if it's a product that society needs and a company wants to know how to do better, I will work with them if I think I'm genuinely going to make a difference. So I've worked with a couple of house builders, and there's a real, I've no idea if anyone on this call is in that sector, but I see some really traditional attitudes. So a lot of the things we need to do to build better houses is not rocket science. The technology has been there for many years. It's well tried and tested. It's just a bit more complicated, and it's a bit harder to build a house. And house builders sometimes work on pretty tight margins, and they just don't want to take the risk of putting in ground source heat pumps, for example, that might be problematic to their mind. So they don't do it. They'd rather put a gas boiler in because it's easier. But the Committee for Climate Change has signalled that there should be no new connections to the gas grid from 2023, I think it is, or 2025. And there's lots of really good stuff out there. So there's the UK Green Building Council, which has published a framework for developers to work on that route to net zero. And they really look at that detail around, it's not just how you build the house, the materials you choose to build it with, and building a timber framed, timber clad building has a much lower environmental impact than a concrete or a masonry building. But they also really encourage people to think about the operational impacts of that house. And I touched on that earlier. So, our climate is going to be very different in the next 20 to 50 years. One of the problems in the summer is we're just going to get too hot in our houses. And the absolute worst case scenario is we'll go and bolt on air conditioning systems. So what can you do now to build a house that is more thermally efficient, but considers the house not overheating as well as the house being too cold? And it can be done. So there are things happening. There was a thing called the Code for Sustainable Homes, which was withdrawn a couple of years ago, sadly. And house builders were being encouraged to build up to higher standards on that. There is a new thing coming in 2023, I think, called the Future Home Standard. And the idea of that is to, rather than, so that there's some very limited things within the building standards at the moment, the Future Home Standard should put a much higher level of mandatory requirements on housing developers. It's still not as strong as it could be. It's not as strong as it should be. But the good news is there are developers who, so a client I'm working with at the moment, so they're looking to build a massive housing development in the UK. They're a local authority, and they are absolutely starting the point of view of this has to be a net neutral carbon development. How are we going to do that? How are we going to enforce that onto our developers? And actually, what do those numbers need to look like? And they're also recognizing that in the scenario, that means they will take less profit, and they're comfortable with that because they want to make sure this development is fit for the future.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Phil, for answering all those questions. You're a mine of information. I can tell you could carry on all night, but I'm not going to let you because we promised to finish around 8:30. Can I